Okay, we're going to be looking at training for muscular fitness. So we're going to need to start off with the very basics of muscles. So all muscles, they are pullers. And so what happens is they contract or push together in order to move our bones. So you see this picture here. We have the muscle and our tendons connecting that muscle to the bones, right? And so if that muscle were to squeeze together, it would also move those two bones closer together. Just like if I squeeze my bicep, you see how big it is, right? My radius and ulna move because my bicep contracts. And so it moves that radius and ulna closer to my humerus. Okay, so all of our muscles do that, just in different locations. So our muscles, they typically work in pairs, okay? And so these two pairs, one contracts while the other relaxes, and the one contracting is considered the agonist, and the one relaxing is the antagonist. Just like when you antagonize someone, you go against someone or you bother them. That's just like the muscles, right? So looking at this pair right here, bicep, tricep. So the bicep right now, when I show you my big muscles, it is the agonist, right? So it's contracting and creating the movement. And then the opposite muscle of it is the tricep, which is the antagonist. As my bicep is shortening, my tricep is lengthening. Now, when I do the opposite movement, when I lengthen, right, now the agonist is the tricep and the antagonist is the bicep. So when I go this direction, the tricep is shortening as the bicep is lengthening. And so the interesting thing about agonist and antagonist muscle pairs is that no one muscle is always an agonist or always an antagonist. It really depends on the movement that's happening, whether it's an antagonist or an agonist muscle movement. So these muscle actions, we have three different types of muscle contractions. So we have concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions. So concentric has to do with the muscle shortening. This is the most common type of muscle contraction we talk about. But concentric, the muscle shortens in length, and eccentric is when the muscle gets bigger in length or lengthens. And then isometric is when the tension or the force on the muscle increases, but there's no movement. And you're thinking, how on earth can that happen? But I want you to pause the video, get down into a plank, and sit there for 30 seconds. Don't move an inch, and see if it gets harder over those 30 seconds. And of course, it does, and that's because you have an isometric or a static contraction. And so what's happening is that more muscle fibers get recruited over time to keep that same exact form that you were just in. So when we look at a muscle, all right, when we look at a muscle, we think of a bicep brachii as a muscle. And that's true. We do consider that a muscle. But if we look deeper into a muscle, right here we have the muscle itself, and then we have bundles of muscle fibers, and those we call fasciculi. And then we have muscle fibers, and then we can break our muscle fibers down into these myofibrils, okay? Myofibrils. And I want you to make sure to go watch that muscle physiology video, and it's going to talk about how those myofibrils work together to cause that contraction, how those myosin heads pull on that actin to really shorten the muscle, okay? So make sure you watch that. Okay, so how do these muscle fiber contractions actually create a force or a power? And so this is based on something we call motor units. So you see right here we have a motor unit, and a motor unit includes the neuron. So this is the neuron that sends the signal from the central nervous system. So remember, the central nervous system is brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. And this would be an example of the peripheral nerve. So the nerve travels to the muscle fiber, okay? And so this is a motor unit, the peripheral nerve and the muscle fiber that it attaches to. So that's a single motor unit innervating one single muscle fiber. Innervating means communicating to or sending information to. So at that neuromuscular junction between the neuron And the muscle, that is where information is being sent between. So this is one motor unit. Now, sometimes we have a motor unit, a simple one like this, just one neuron going to one single muscle fiber. And something like this is for delicate movements. All right, so it just goes to very few fibers. Delicate movement would be something like when you write, you have a lot of different direction changes to make different letters, and they only need to be a tiny bit of force to create that angle of movement, and so you only have to innervate a very few number of muscle fibers. Now we have other examples of motor units, like down here, this motor unit X. Notice that it's going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different muscle fibers. You see that you have one neuromuscular junction, 2, 3, 4, right? 5, this one over here, neuromuscular junction. So this motor unit X, it goes to and sends that signal to 5 muscle fibers at the exact same time. And so it's similar to this idea that I know you have heard of before, right? We have one sheet of paper, and if I want to rip that one sheet of paper, super easy, right? Takes almost no force. But let's say I want to rip this entire notebook in half, right? Now, because it goes to, I don't know, 100, I don't know how many pages are in this, 100 pages, I can't because I don't have enough force to do that. Just like this, with one motor unit, it creates just a tiny bit of force, but with lots, it creates a lot of force. Okay, so when we're doing very powerful movements, our motor units are going to be innervating lots of muscle fibers. So let's say I want to jump as high as I possibly can. I need to recruit lots of muscle fibers in my legs so that I can get off the ground and lift my body weight off the ground. So notice motor unit X, motor unit Y. Which one of these two do you think will produce more force or power? So motor unit X innervates 5 muscle fibers, and motor unit Y innervates 9 muscle fibers. So Y will produce more force because it innervates more muscle fibers, creating more force when they contract at the same time. And so as athletes develop skills, they learn how many motor units to recruit at the same time and in what order to recruit them, and that's actually what makes athletes more skilled. And so there's this idea of muscle soreness that most people have completely wrong. So most people say, oh, my legs are sore because of the lactic acid buildup. People always say that, but that is dead wrong. Lactic acid buildup does not cause muscle soreness. What causes muscle soreness are these little strains, or like micro tears, not complete tears, but partial tears within the muscle fibers themselves. And those tears are what cause that soreness. Now, you think, oh, that doesn't sound good, but the tears are actually really good because when there's a tear, then the body goes and rebuilds it, and that rebuilding process is actually how we become stronger. So when we hear people say, oh, I have gains, or they're getting bigger muscles, that's because there have been these muscle tears, and then the body comes and rebuilds it so that it can produce that force next time. Okay, so when it comes to resistance training, there's 2 different ways that we build strength with resistance training. So when people, let's say someone who's never been to the gym before and goes to the gym to start lifting weights. So there's 2 different things that are changing, not just one. Most people think those muscles are growing, and that does happen. But first, way before that, the nervous and muscular system recruitment is what's actually improving. So the specific muscle fibers that are innervated and the order and the speed at which they're recruited at is actually what improves first. And so when someone first starts a training regimen in the gym, they improve really fast at the beginning, and that's because that's what's changing. Their motor unit recruitment and the order and the speed that it happens at. That's what changes at first, and then it starts to slow down that progression, and that slowdown in progression is because now we're at the point where muscle fibers are actually growing. And so the increase in muscle fiber size is called hypertrophy when they're getting larger. And we see this happen much more quickly and easily in fast twitch fibers as opposed to the slow twitch fibers. They struggle to have a lot of hypertrophy, but if someone has a lot of fast twitch fibers, they much more easily see hypertrophy. So when it comes to resistance training, there's two main types of resistance training. And so we can split it into kind of free weights and fixed resistance machines. So an example would be something like a pec deck. I don't know if you've heard of this, but this is a machine where you go like this, and it works on the pectoral muscles, and that's why it's called a pec deck. So this would be a fixed resistance machine, but we could do a similar type of action and hold barbells and go like this as well with just a simple dumbbell, okay? And so that would be a free weight. Now, which is better for who? And so that's really more what we're looking at. Free weights are really great because you get to use a lot more muscles doing this. So if we're doing if we're using free weights to do this, we're having to engage a lot more muscles to hold our body in place. So there's a lot more muscles being activated, and we call those stabilizer muscles that are helping out besides just the pectoralis muscles. So this is really good for people who are more advanced, but somebody who is just beginning to add in resistance training, the fixed machines are much more safe because they make sure that a person is using proper form. So it guides them and they don't have a choice. They can't move one arm lower, go to the side, anything like that, because it is fixed. And so those are safer for people that are first learning. Okay, so a couple of terms when we talk about a repetition. So let's say I'm doing bicep curls, 1, 2, 3 reps, okay? I did 3 reps or 3 times through, and then that is my first set. Now, if I'm going to do 5 sets, I do that first set, then I break for a minute to rest, and then I do 1, 2, 3 reps again. Now I've done a second set. Okay, so these are terms that you'll hear and see if you're looking up resistance training programs. Now, what sport you're in is going to determine what type of resistance training you want to do. And it doesn't matter what sport you are, you will do some of both, but it's more of an emphasis on one than another. Okay, so we're going to look at how much force or the amount of weight. So weight would mean like low weights or very heavy weights, okay? So a maximum force would be a very heavy weight versus a minimum force would be a very low weight, which isn't very difficult to do. And then when we look at the repetitions, that means how many reps someone does. So if it's just 1 or lots and lots of reps, like 10, 20, 30 reps. So in more endurance sports, when we're trying to train those slow twitch fibers, we're going to do many more reps and much lower resistance. So these are things like a swimmer who's doing distance swimming or a cross-country runner, as opposed to a weightlifter who would need to do fewer reps and heavier weights because their entire goal is for one repetition maxes to max out at a higher weight. So it really depends on the sport. Now, you're still going to do, even if you're a cross-country distance runner, you're still going to do some 1 rep max to see where you're at, but you aren't going to do it frequently and often. So when it comes to weight training, some important things that we want to look at is safety. So you want to make sure you're using proper technique and you're teaching your athletes proper technique, because without that, they're at a high risk for injuries, and this happens fairly frequently, especially with high school age students, because they want to be tough in front of their friends, and so they try to go really hard. You always want an adult supervising, and you want to have somebody spotting there in case something does go wrong, and you always want to have these collars on the bar. And so let's say someone has a barbell and they're trying to lift it above their head. Well, if one arm is a little higher and you don't have these collars on the end, the weight could slip off. And so this is just a safety mechanism. Now, when it comes to building that program, you're going to use lots of the same principles as any other type of training, but you specifically want to look at the specificity principle and the overload principle. Those are the two most important ones that you want to pay attention to.